Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a baby penguin in graphite. Now my aim for this project was to achieve a high level of realism when working on a smaller scale. Now in order to do this, the contrast as always is very important. This is something that I talk a lot about in all of my tutorials. But the pencil and eraser techniques, how we're using the paper blending stumps for softening, all of these techniques need to be more refined. Now this is really worthwhile when working on larger projects because we're already confident with using those supplies for trying to get those finer details for smaller projects. Now one thing that is important here is when working on a smaller scale is not to force too much detail. We still want it to look detailed, but by forcing in too much it can actually make that drawing look less realistic. So for example here, if I add too much detail I can actually make the feathers look a little bit wiry. So I really do need to be getting that balance just right. Now another reason why I love working on these smaller projects in between larger or more complex drawings is because they are really worthwhile to overcome that feeling of being burnt out. Now because this is a smaller drawing, we're still focusing on that high level of realism, but we can get this done within a few hours. Whereas a larger piece to this same level of realism would take days or weeks to get finished. Now that of course is just necessary when working on a larger scale, but if we're already feeling like we are not quite in that right mindset to be drawing, then setting ourselves up to spend days on one project is not going to really help that feeling of being burnt out. Whereas a little project like this can be just what's needed to then bring back that creativity. Now when I'm working with my base layers here, the same techniques that I'm using are exactly the same when working on a larger scale. So another reason why I find this so useful with these smaller drawings is because I'm using all of the same techniques that are required for larger, more complex pieces. So it's never time wasted. Now in the real-time tutorial, which is all linked in the description below if that's of interest, I really do focus on pencil technique, how to move the pencil, the pressure to apply, and so on. But one of my biggest considerations here was to make sure that the feathers didn't look like fur. Now because this is a baby bird, it has more of that downy or fluffier texture, so I really wanted to make sure that I captured that. Now by focusing on how long the pencil stroke should be and the direction, it's very similar to a technique when drawing fur, but I wanted to make sure here that I didn't have too much separation between my pencil strokes. That's going to help to give more of this softness. Now another factor is the contrast, which I've briefly mentioned already, but contrast is what helps to make that drawing look three-dimensional. Now I'm really building up my layers gradually here to try to enhance how dark the feathers are on the face. And this is something that's going to really help with avoiding that feather looking like fur. There's not any real definition between the midtones or highlights, so I really wanted to make sure that I captured that. Whereas potentially with fur that's more thicker or overlapped, you're going to have more of the shadows and those shapes visible. So here I've taken the time to add my layers and really focus in on the feather direction, but we don't want too much definition between the layers here. Now when I began working on the white patches around the eyes, I'm really focusing here on where the black feathers meet the white feathers. I wanted to make sure that I had those sections overlapped, and even if I had space just to add 3 or 4 of those details, that I made sure that I included them. Now of course working on a smaller scale like this, I don't have room to add in all of the feathers there around the eyes, but by making sure I've got my main lights and darks mapped in, and I'm hinting at the direction of those feathers, it's already made it look like it's far more detailed than it actually is. And this is one of those key focuses when working on a smaller scale. Now something that I really like to focus on in my real-time tutorials is what layer to draw first. Now I think this makes the entire drawing process much easier because if we're trying to focus on the wrong layer too soon, then it can significantly limit the depth that's achieved, the realism can be affected, and then we can start to get stressed with the drawing process. So by simplifying that as much as possible and breaking it down into one layer at a time and those smaller sections, I find really beneficial. Now when working with the graphite here, where I'm starting to use more of my erasers, I'm again focusing on that layer in order. So I've made sure to get all of the feathers completed underneath, and then I can come back in here and add some of the snow. Now for that snow, I was just using my battery eraser, but I want to be making sure there that I've got all of the layers of graphite finished before I add those top details. Now my personal preference is to work in smaller sections, and I really find that that helps to reduce that chance of being overwhelmed and also hesitating. Now if I'm spending too much time looking at my reference photo trying to work out where I am, then that for me is an indication that I'm working on too much of a larger area. Now if you are an artist who likes working in whole individual layers, then of course that is absolutely fine. But if you do start to feel a bit overwhelmed, then it might be worth just focusing on one section at a time. Now throughout all of the drawing process, I'm always focusing on the contrast and the values that are needed for the area that I'm working on. Now this section of the adult behind the baby is a great example. So the highlight there on the larger surface of the lower part of the adult's body was quite a bit brighter, so I needed to make sure that I didn't have too many darker values. But I also still wanted to make sure that I had just that right level of the variation of my lights and my darks so that it didn't look like it was unfinished. Now I also wanted to have that effect where the body of the adult was a little bit out of focus, especially on the left side. Now as I progress through this drawing, there's going to be more detail on this lower corner that I'm working on, but again I need to focus on what to draw first. So some of those feathers are actually overlapping the creases of the skin underneath, so I need to leave that area be for now and then I can come back to it. So really focusing on what bit to draw first can help so much with how we're going to then progress through that drawing. Now this is a great example of how by breaking it up one toe at a time, one small section at a time, can really help to keep that drawing momentum going. Now if I started to feel stressed or overwhelmed here, because this is quite a complex element to get right, then there's no harm in taking a break. Those times away from the easel where we're resting our eyes are just as valuable as the time drawing. Now if we're working with tired eyes or we know that we're starting to rush but we want to get that portrait finished, then decisions are going to be made that would potentially have a negative effect on the drawing process. So taking that time out is crucial. However, working through an area like this, you can see that I focused on my main lights and darks and just those shapes that they created. I've not really visualized this as a toe. It's more about where the highlights and the shadows are positioned, and once finished it then looks like a foot. Now in the reference photo, that adult's foot on the left there was a little bit out of focus, so I wanted to make sure that I didn't get too carried away with the details, otherwise that's going to pull focus there, which would affect the perspective. This photo is taken on a little bit of an angle, so I wanted to make sure that I've captured that. Now as I started to work on the body, I really wanted to make sure that I was being aware of how many of those details I was including. And again, this is a real focus throughout these smaller projects. Now I still want to make sure that I'm capturing all of the three key fundamental pencil techniques. So that is the feather direction, the feather thickness, and the feather length. So all of these same concepts apply when drawing fur, and I've got lots of tutorials here on YouTube that show many different fur types. But you can see here that I'm focusing on building up a good base foundation before I jump into my details. Now, although the base foundation is covered up with the details to some degree, they always still do also show through. So this is where I want to be making sure that I've got that base foundation right, because I do feel that it makes a big difference when the details are added on top. Now it's also knowing at what point to add your highlights. So if highlights are added too soon and the layers underneath aren't dark enough, those highlights aren't going to appear as bright. So for example here, as I come back in with my Tombow mono eraser, you can see that those highlights are visible, but that's because I've made sure that my layers of graphite underneath are dark enough. If you are at a point where you're using your erasers and they're not really showing up, it could just be that the base layer underneath is not dark enough to allow those highlights to appear brighter. By coming back in and darkening those layers, which could either be done with graphite powder or your graphite pencils, and then going back in with your erasers, it should then mean that those highlights are far more visible. Now, of course, there are other factors that can affect that. How we're holding and moving the eraser can also impact how effective they are. But I usually find with that, it's more so about how the graphite's been applied. So if, for example, more pressure has been used on the graphite pencils throughout each of the layers, and we've gone back to more of a burnishing technique, and burnishing is where we are using more pressure and sort of flattening the tooth of the paper, that there can make it much harder for the erasers to lift that graphite off the surface. So how the graphite is applied is important for all techniques. Now this foot is going to really demonstrate how breaking it up one toe at a time has simplified the process. And it doesn't look good early on. This is another factor to consider, that all of the layers that we're adding here, it's going to go through those stages where it's almost like we're going backwards. But once we've achieved a good base foundation like I have here, I'm now coming back in and darkening things and then also working with my highlights. This is now very quickly gone from something that doesn't look that accurate to looking far more three-dimensional. Now another thing that can really help with this, if there is an area of the portrait that looks confusing, such as this foot, is you can turn your drawing and your reference photo upside down. Now what this will do is it will force your brain to see that more for abstract shapes, rather than in this case a foot. So being able to then visualize it like that means that we're more likely to just focus on those lights and darks and the shapes that they're creating, so that by the time everything's then put back up the right way, it looks more like that reference photo. Something else you can also do is take a photo of your drawing and then look at it on a smaller screen. So if you just then glance at that on your phone, it's usually a bit easier to notice anything that needs to be adjusted. Now as I'm working more on this corner, this is where I need to be focusing on what element is drawn first. So because the top sections of the adult's feathers are sitting over the top of the toes, I needed to make sure that I'd got all of the skin and the claws drawn in, so that any feathers that did overlap could be naturally added at the end. So again here, where the skin is sort of folded over the edge of the foot, I want to be making sure that I've drawn that first before I get too carried away with those brighter highlights of the feathers. Now by breaking it up with the reference photo for what layer to draw first, as I've mentioned throughout this video, it can simplify the entire drawing process. This one corner of the drawing is quite confusing because of how the feathers are overlapping different sections of the skin. Obviously, if this adult penguin was to stand up, that fold of skin above the foot would not be visible. So it's just about trying to visualize what bit we should be drawing first in relation to the anatomy, the feather structure or the fur, whatever it is that we're drawing. Now before I added those finer highlights and details, I wanted to make sure that I had some of the snow drawn in. Now this came together really quickly because all I'm using here is my graphite powder. I've applied that there with this blending stump and I'm creating that outer focus effect. I'm still hinting at my lights and my darks to give that impression of snow, but just avoiding those finer details given that I wanted the left side to be a little bit more softer and out of focus. So I do hope that this tutorial has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a thumbs up because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you would like to draw along to this real-time tutorial or any of my other step-by-step lessons, then I'll link all of the information to those in the description below. If you do have any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.